Chapter 1 is in regards to sociological perspective. When we're talking about sociological perspective, we're looking at the context in regards to how human behavior is placed within us in this broad social context, right? We're looking at the how people live, how people organize themselves, how do we monitor in regards to how we act differently between our home living versus our environment living. And that's what kind of leads us into this sociological global context of our location as well. When we're talking about location, it's where do we live, how do we function within it, the members that we allow to be within our sociological center, basically, or in regards to our society centers. Who do we have our shared cultures and our shared territories with, right? So when we're looking at sociological perspective, like I mentioned, it's the emphasis on the social context in which people live. How are we influenced by our society? People who we share our culture with, who we share our territory with, right? Our social locations are basically the corners in life in which we occupy, become, um, because it's a place in our society. It's a place that we interfere with people with. It's the way how we communicate. Um, your job abilities. You tend to communicate people within your jobs differently than you would in regards to your home environment, like I just mentioned. You tend to associate people more within your income range. You tend to associate with people in your educational kind of same brackets. Gender as well, age as well, along with the race and ethnicity. You tend to characterize from your cultural aspects and in regards to how you group up within members within your location, within your history, within your small society that you kind of work within. Males tend to group up with males on some aspects. They tend to feel more comfortable to be more open around females and being more vulnerable in regards to that aspects, whereas women tend to do the same thing. Yes, they have close girlfriends, but at the same time they feel more comfortable talking to certain men regards to certain location or certain aspects. So we kind of see our social context from a different aspects in regards to a broader type, um, um, a broader type in regards to the aspects of how we want to engage with other people. um, Wright Mills, Charles Wright Mills, is the one that came up with this sociological perspective. He is the history, location, and a broad schemes of events. And they look at it from a single event, not through multiple events. Biography is an individual's specific experience, right? External influences, our experiences become part of what our thinking and our motivations are. We have to have some type of motivation. We have to think of some way, somehow, something to make us motivate to do what we do. Um, so that's how broad the the kind of aspects of our social context in regards to our sociological perspectives. When we're looking at this, sociological perspectives, when we're talking about homeless people, automatically we can kind of take our own kind of in terms and silence on regards to homeless, some of the common things, some of the stereotypics in regards to homeless shelters, in regards to homeless people. But however, we have this view of life and exciting things to talk about. And unfortunately, homelessness are not a part of that. So kind of something to kind of think about and kind of label right now. And, we all stereotype certain people. But when you're looking at this picture, would you label her as homeless if you saw her on the streets? What would you label her as? Would you label her as maybe partying too hard? Maybe she's a drunk, because of the way she's dressed, the way how she has a McDonald's cup in her hand, her hair is done, you know. Would you think of her possibly being maybe even drug addiction or that type of aspects? Would you really label her as homeless? So when we're looking at that type of broad social context, that's how the social context of our our sociological perspectives can kind of tend to guide us in different ways, kind of give us a different views, different type of aspects, our different type of traditional, what you would just normally think of. when we're looking at the global context and the local type aspects, the global village type aspects is one of those ways in regards to how um, we went from isolated living, farmlands, that type of thing, to more of small town type aspects. However, when we look globally, not everybody has the means of what US individuals have. Some areas still live in the global village in regards to where they are living in small villages, where the women are still the individuals that take care of, still go get water because there's no running water in the homes, right? At the same time, you could look at the global context of, our instant communication. We have our lovely technology that allows us to pick up our phone, text somebody, call somebody, instant message somebody, whatever it may be. We have this instant communication. However, globally, there's still countries that don't have that instant communication. They lack that connection still. So when we're looking at from our global context in regards to that broad sociological perspective, it's one of those situations to where our global village is only as big as we can possibly get it. However, we need certain things in order to survive. When you look at on a bigger context in regards to um, the global villages, well, they all have to work together within that village, to make sure they have the necessary needs to maintain and survive. The old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, that's kind of where that concept came from, because if one woman takes, off to go get, the fetch the water, can she take all of her kids with her? No, because then her hands are being held up by other kids. So a lot of times the other villagers would take care of. So it's kind of one of those situations, when we're thinking about our sociological perspective in regards to a global unit, we kind of live within that still village type aspects because we still need certain things to make us work. But at the same time, you know, we've kind of weakened those ties as well. They're not as strong as those global villages used to be. When we look at the origins of sociology, we're looking at tradition versus science. We're looking at how positivism came about. Who was the founder of sociology? How did we get as far as we have in sociology? That's where all these terms kind of come into play. So when we're looking at the traditional versus science and setting the stage for the birth of sociology, Industrial Revolution was that stage. At the Industrial Revolution stage is kind of where things kind of shift for sociology. Tradition cannot answer life's difficult questions, those life difficult questions in regards to what should I do in my life? What should I do for work? Should I go to education? Sociology can't answer those. However, you as an individual can. The other one is political revolution, imperialism. As we're applying the scientific method to questions about social life, we're finding out things that we still cannot, traditionally answer. Science can't answer all those traditional questions. So you have this means in regards to objective, systematic observation, testing theories. We'll come across theories in regards to later in the chapters in regards to functional, conflict, symbolic interactions. So it's one of those things that all these terms have a meaning in regards to how do we, from traditional aspects to more of a science-based, how do we get this into a scientific method? How can we make it observable and measurable and make it make sense to where it has the fidelity that we need? So when we're talking about Augustine Comet, he is known for positivism. Positivism is an application of the scientific approach in regards to the social world. In 1791, women were shown here marching, doing what they have to do to confront the kings and queens in France in regards to the French Revolution. This is 1700, so women trying to still get their rights, trying to prove to, how society needs to change. So they kind of looked at it from a positive, type way. How do you take a scientific approach in regards to the social world in regards to this aspects? If you think about, when it comes to women's rights and marchings and need society changes and stuff like that, 1791 to 2020 has there been a lot changed. Yeah, there has been a lot changed. There's been a lot of, um, laws that have been changed in that type of aspects, but there's still some things that women still feel that they don't have the equality of things. So they're still marching. They're still wanting, society to change and that type of aspects. So if you want to put that positivism, the application of scientific approach in regards to it, you would have to kind of analyze in regards to how much and what has really changed from 1791 to 2020. When we're looking at continuing with Augustine comment, when we're giving the credit to who was the founder of sociology, he was the founder of sociology. He began to analyze the basis of social order. He stressed the scientific method should be applied to the study of society, but however, he didn't apply it to himself. He kind of looked at it as the fact, like, do as I say, not as I do type approach. But at the same time, if you think about when he was alive, 1798 to 1857, what was the mindset in regards to society back then, right? Back then, women, they were expected to cook, clean, take care of the children in church. There's the 4 C's, right? Cook, clean, children, or actually it was cook, clothing, children, and church. Those are the 4 C's. Your book will call them the 4 K's for German. But in regards to that, that is what, during this time frame, that was the aspects. So how can you apply the scientific method if you, don't follow it yourself, more or less, in regards to wanting to change society? He actually also wondered in regards to what held society together. He coined the term sociology. If you think about it, and if you want to get in depth and detailed in regards to it, what really holds us together? How do we function? We have some chaos that goes on, not major, but we still have, but then there's times that we do have major chaos that goes on. How do we adapt? How do we function? How do we hold it all together still, right? So that's kind of, our founder in regards to sociology. It's like I said, Augustine comment is the founder for sociology. Kind of keep that in mind. He's the founder. When we're talking about Herbert Spence and the social Darwinism, Herbert Spence kind of looked at the times of sociology from 1820 to 1903. He is the second founder of sociology. He thought that it would helping the poor was wrong, that it was merely helped the less fit to survive. He looked at it as, if you want to help this individual, then therefore you are, going to be less fit to survive yourself. So he disagreed sharply with Common's ideals that sociologists should guide social reform. In other words, if you have that change. He thought there was a lower and higher forms of society. He looked at it as, upper class, middle class, lower class type aspects. He thought there was, the lower to higher forms of society. He coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest is just basically a term in regards to involved over time, the fittest people adapt to the environment, whereas the less fit don't adapt and they kind of fall off. So if you were considered survival of the fittest, you were able to survive on your own, you had the means to sustain and be wealthy in all that aspects. You were able to sustain life. Karl Marx and class conflict, kind of a little bit of a conflict, right? Karl Marx was from 1818 to 1883. He looked at the fact of he believed that the roots of human misery laid in the class conflict. Although Marx did not consider himself a sociologist, his ideals have influenced many sociologists, particularly conflict theorists. They look at him as being the founder of the conflict theorist. He looked at the exploitation of workers, proletariats, right? These are the workers. These are the ones that are going out into the field, doing what they have to do day in, day out, your manual labor guys, right? By capitalists, these are the ones who own the means of production. These are the ones that own factories, own the lands, they have money, they are able to sustain themselves. They are the ones that own the businesses and still employ people. These are called bourgeois. Capitalist, right? He also thought that social change, workers overthrowing the capitalists, was going to happen regardless, right? Regardless of what was going to happen, it was going to happen. If you think about it, from 1818 to 1883, during this time frame, workers were expected to be workers, and you weren't expected to think, you know what, I'm going to own my own business at one point in time. That's what he was talking about throughout social change. That eventually workers would overthrow those capitalists. In other words, those workers would eventually become a business owner at one point in time. Durkheim was a social integration. He looked at it as from a concept in regards to the degrees in which people are tied to their social groups. So he was a French sociologist that contributed many important concepts to sociology. He looked at the comparative the suicide rates of several countries and revealed an underlying social factor. When we're looking at our social integration is the ways that we engage to our outside groups and societies, that we feel united and we share our values. We have some type of a bond, right? It's also known as social cohesion, social integration, right? It's something that we enjoy to do. We have certain people that we like to go out and maybe go to concerts with, or we have certain people that we like to do certain things with. You're integrating with them at a point to, because you are feeling united at some point in time, that you're feeling that you have some type of shared values, right? The way how Durkheim looked at it when he compared the suicide rates over several different countries, and when he found the underlying factor had to do with social integration. He said more people are likely to commit suicide if their ties to others in the community are weak, meaning they lack that social integration. Through his research, he also looked at individuals who were married and divorced and that type of aspects. Divorce during this time is not as high as it is now, but at the same time, when he looked at the whole picture of this, he looked at the fact of, the ones that were divorced, the men were more unlikely to commit suicide because they lost that social connection. They lost that social integration. They isolated themselves. They kind of separated themselves from their integrated portion, or their integrated groups that they used to, because they didn't want to have to cross paths with their ex-wives and that type of aspects. So that's how he looked at it. He got sociology recognized as a separate discipline. It used to be all coincide together. We, even at VVC at one point in time, had poli-sci and sociology combined together. However, psychology, sociology, poli-sci all used to be merged together, but now sociology is as a separate discipline. And he also studied how social forces affected behavior. Like, how does our environment, how does this, society or our social forces affect us? How do we behave differently? Why do we behave differently? So he looked at that aspects. He identified social integration, the degree to which people are tied to their social groups. He identified the key roles of social integration in social life remains control, or remains that central to society or to sociology today. So when we're looking at this, and we look at the patterns of behaviors and the events that occur and the behaviors that occurs with them, that's what they're talking about, that social integration aspects. This is kind of part of his research here in regards to the Society of Americas. If you look at from 18 to 24 in regards to race and ethnicity, males to females, across various different aspects, you could kind of see when you're looking at the suicide rates in the graphs, he stressed there was a pattern, reoccurring every year that indicates something beyond the individuals who kill themselves, right? The pattern reflects conditions in society and how people reacted to those conditions. So it really depends in regards to what conditions happen. I gave you an example of divorce, but you're also talking about other heavier different factions. I'm going to leave you with this question before I move on to the next, before I move on to Weber. When you're looking at this graph, why is there, and this kind of goes with that sociological scientific method type aspects, why is there more men than women that are committing suicide? It's one of those situations, kind of think about it. What's the aspects about it? And from my history throughout, my studies and my research and stuff like that, I have found that when it comes to suicide, if a man is threatening to commit suicide, he is meaning that he is going to do it. In other words, he will make sure that he follows through with what he says. However, women, on the other hand, tend to state they're going to do it, but they have a weaker source of completing the actions, where men takes the more forceful actions. So you kind of go with that in regards to that. But and when you're looking at the actual rates between 18 to 24 across the various different, race and ethnicities, you can kind of see, across all of them, men are on the higher side. When we're looking at Weber and we're looking at the Protestant ethics, Max Weber was from 1864 to 1920. And he was another early sociologist who left a profound impression on sociology, right? He was one of those that he used cross cultures and historical materials to trace the causes of social change and how to determine how society groups affected people's orientation to life, right? He kind of, looked at the fact, okay, well, how come this culture over here kind of does this way and this culture over here kind of does it this way? So he kind of looked at the aspects in regards to that. And it kind of came up to where a lot of it had to do with the religion and the origin of the capitalism. He disagreed with Marx' claim to economics is the central force of social change. He said, no, religion is the force of social change. That's the reason why the Protestant ethics kind of came into place. He said the role belonged to the religion. He said the religion is central force of social change. That's the only way how it's going to happen. The ones that go to church and especially the ones that were Protestant ethics have more of a solid background, and therefore they are to be more of a spirit of capitalism type aspects. He says the term that desires the invested capital in order to make more money is the spirit of capitalism. When we're looking at sociology in North America, the sexism in regards to early women in the sociology fields, attitudes of the time of the 1800s, their sex roles were rigidly defined. Women, like I said, were expected to remain in home. They weren't expected to have a higher education. They weren't expected to publish papers. They weren't expected to do anything like that. Very few and far between people had education beyond the basics. And we're talking basics of like 4th and 5th grade, nothing more than 6th grade. And then when we're looking at the aspects of it, and if you guys have ever done like a research paper or that type of thing, the reason why, if you've ever done it, the reason why they use first initials for the first name and then the last name is because it got changed so that way women who had a higher education would be recognized for the work that they did. In other words, if you put your initial was, I'll use mine for an example, R. Negretti, you would never know if I was a male or a female. You just know I'm R. Negretti. So it's one of those situations to where that's the reason why a lot of the MLA, the APA, all like the research aspects when you're doing your reference page and stuff like that, that's the reason why it's only a first initial and last name. It was to kind of avoid to allow women to get their acknowledgement because they had the higher education. But throughout the time, these are all forgotten sociologists who are female. They had some type of point. They had higher degrees. Beatrice Potter Weber, she's right here at the top. She was a self-educator, but all of pretty much the rest of them, they all either had some type of a university background. They went to college, they had that education. However, they're kind of forgotten because of the times. Because of their higher education, it was one of those situations they really didn't, they existed, but they weren't acknowledged through any type of aspects of like written proposal type work. Harriet, she was interested in social reform. She wanted the change. She wanted society to take it by the bulls. She turned to sociology, where she discovered the writings of Augustine Comte. She became an advocate for the slavery. She traveled widely. She wanted to, that social reform. So in order to get her word out and to share all of her information, she had to travel. She wrote extensively analysis of social life, but her work was largely ignored. She published in Society in America before Durkheim and Weber were even born. So this is going back in regards to, yes, having that higher education, wanted to do a social change, but no one would listen to her. So no one would read her, it was completely just ignored in regards to all of her research. Society in America is a platform in regards to where a lot of people publish papers and stuff like that. For those of you who don't know that. But, she was writing into it and publishing before Durkheim and Weber were even born. So it just kind of shows you that she was writing in it for a while. William Edward Du Bois, he spent his lifetime studying relationships between African Americans and whites. Like many early North American sociologists, he combined the role of academic of sociologists with that of social reform. He was the first to obtain a Harvard PhD for African American, and he published a book a year from 1896 to 1914. However, he was neglected from the sociologists until recently. If you think about it, for a sociologist during this time frame, and in regards to studying and what the relationships he did study, you could kind of see in regards to the fact that because he was African American, a lot of his work wasn't taken serious, because it was until 1960 where the segregation kind of took place, where the Jim Crow law said, no more segregation. So he only lived 3 more years past that. So a lot of his work was neglected by sociologists, like I said, until recently. However, here's kind of what you kind of see in regards to what he studied. He, in the 1800s, he studied most people that were poor from the African American side. He also looked at the formal education, the formal education beyond the first several grades was a luxury. So he kind of took that in consideration when he did his research, like what's the difference in regards to who had beyond, first grade levels. And then, the families that he looked at, if you look, their house is very ran down. You can kind of see a house behind, a little nicer, 2-story. This one's only 1. But at the same time, what's the difference during this time frame? Why was there big a difference? They were doing majority of the work. When you're looking at this, are these all kids? Is there an adult there? So it's kind of one of those things, you kind of look at the aspects in regards to the individuals that he did research on, and you can kind of see how research and scientific method could kind of imply in regards to the social reform that needed to be done during this time. Jane Addams, she was an individual that combined sociology with social reform. She was a co-founder and co-founder of the Hull House of Immigrants, the sick, the aged, and the poor. She did a lot of co-founding stuff. She also did a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Unions. She was also a co-winner of a Nobel Prize of Peace. Notice co-winner, she was not able to win it on her own, right? She was the leader of women's rights movements, women's suffrage, and she was the leader for peace movement in the World War I era. She did a lot of work for the sick, the aged, the poor. She did a lot of social reform, wanting to change. She did a lot of women right movements in regards to, stating that there is equal rights across, that there shouldn't be the segregation and that type of aspects, that women had voices as well. So she did a lot of work in regards to those types of movements. But the one that really kind of sticks out the more or less in regards to the importance is that she was a co-founder for the sociologists, for early sociologists and social reform. In order for her to win that Nobel Prize for Peace, she had to be a co-winner. There was no way for her to win it on her own. When you're looking at the theory versus reform, Scott Parsons and Charles Wright Mills kind of looked at the two in regards to the theory type aspects and said, okay, well, we have this society that could be possibly be corrupted and needs reform, right? Early sociologists in North America, they looked at it as, what parts needed to be reformed. They looked more or less in regards to the political and economic aspects that needed to be reformed, in part, partially being corrupted in regards to that aspects. Parsons said, you know what, no, we need some type of development, objective analysis and models of society. So how are we expected to change this if we can't set up the right models, right? And Mills deplored theoretical abstractions in favor of social reform. So, it was like one of those situations where it's like, okay, you know what, if we can't model the proper way, then we just need to change it altogether, to where it makes sense and it works. So they kind of came up with an aspects, and which I'll, the continuing tension in regards to the theory versus reform that we'll get to. But at the same time, because you can see, Mills was a very controversial figure in sociology because of his analysis of the role of the power elites. These power elites are corporations, military, and politicians. Today, his analysis is taken for granted by many sociologists and members of the public because the way how he looked at it was, this was his model on how parts of society work together. And if you don't work together, then you're going to have this chaotic type situation. So that's the reason why he called these power elites the top leaders of businesses, corporations, politics and military. They had this interest in Mills and analyzing increase in each time the United States undergoes turbulence. And he said because they were at the forefronts, then that was kind of the reason why that maybe there was a controversial in regards to that social change type aspects. So they kind of continued the tension in regards to this and kind of said, you know what, we have a basic sociology aspects. We have this basic pure sociology, right? It's a sociological research for the purpose of making discoveries about life in human groups, right? It's to gain that knowledge, it's to understand a little bit more. But from there, what are you supposed to do with that knowledge? What do you do with it? Do you bottle it up? Do you write it on paper? What do you do? So they kind of said, well, you have to apply it to sociology somehow, some way. So using sociology, that social reform, they used it to solve the problems. When we're looking at the applied, it's just basically, from a micro level, which is class interaction and family relationships, to a macro level, which is poverty and pollution, which we get into macro and micro later in the chapters. But if you take the social problems that we have, you need to put it either to a bigger picture, or you need to shrink it down. So macro being the large and micro being the small. What problem does it really fall underneath? Okay, well, now that you've applied it, now you have this public, applying the sociology for the public good. How do we benefit the public from our sociological perspectives after we've got all this knowledge, we're applying it? What's the benefit for the public of it? So that's the public of sociology. How things are related to one another, guiding the politicians and making policymakers make sense and make sure we understand and making sure that we're all working together. Public of sociology, right? It's the harnesses, like I said, for the benefit of the public. And when you're looking at social reform, you're looking at it from a risky type aspects, right? You're looking at, okay, if you apply all this, are you going to disrupt the status quo? Are you going to cause chaos? Are you going to create more problems? Are you going to, disrupt to the point of no return? So you kind of have to be careful when you do try to apply all of the information and you try to do the social change or the social reform, the social change, because it can disrupt the status quo and create more problems later down the road. So kind of in a bar graph of everything that we just discussed in regards to the basic of sociology, constructing that theory and testing that hypothesis, research on basic social life and how groups affect people. The middle kind of ground is the criticism of the society and social policies. Okay, great. And then now you have your public, right? And then you have your applied. So sometimes your applied comes before your public because you want to make sure that you're analyzing the problem and evaluating the problems and suggesting the solutions before you're really applying them out into the real type situation. So when we're looking at this and we're thinking of the basic, the public, and the applied in this type of graph, how would we use social reform in regards to getting the callback rates by race and ethnicity in a criminal record? You know, they proved in between whites and African Americans. Without a criminal record, regardless, whites will get more of a callback. Well, should it really matter if they're both qualified? The individuals are qualified to do the job. What makes the difference of the race and ethnicity of the individual, right? But then they add a crime record on top of it. Well, they still found that whites got a higher criminal record. The ones that had a criminal record still received a high callback rate, even though they had the charge against them. So with using this basic, public, and applied of sociology, how can we change this aspects? What can you do? What are some things that you could form in regards to making sure that this doesn't continue, that we change the patterns of society? So this is kind of giving you that you know, how that all the information kind of goes together in regards to how to get your knowledge, do your, you know, research, do your theories, get your hypothesis together, and then go from there. So when we're looking at from a theoretical perspective in sociology, we have individuals use certain type of symbols. And when we're looking at symbols, the symbolic interactionism is basically just applying symbols to certain effects of expectations. How do people use symbols in everyday lives? How do people show that they're married? What are the symbols to show that you're married? What are some symbols that show that you're divorced? What are some symbols that show that you're a parent? What are some symbols that you show that you're in love? If you think about all those different types of symbols, each one of them has a different meaning behind it. Not only that, there's also symbols for religion. Certain symbols, you know, expectations are expected to go by the religion as well. Symbolic interactionism is a part of society or sociology. It's a theoretical approach. It's from a micro, so it's from the small levels on how we analyze. So George Herbert Mead is one of the founders of the symbolic interactionism, a major theoretical perspective in sociology. He taught at the University of Chicago, where his lectures were popular, but he wrote very little. And this is kind of where I kind of teeter-totter with this last sentence. After his death, his students compiled all of his lectures into an influential book called Mind, Self of Society. My thing is that if he was such a great instructor and his lectures were so popular, before he died, why didn't the students kind of say, hey, let's help you get all your words on paper type aspects, right? The symbol, kind of showing him the symbol that they cared about him, right? It's kind of one of those situations to where that kind of is always stuck with me in regards to, it's kind of like he got a little shortchanged in regard to showing his symbols of his interactionism in regards to our everyday lifestyles, right? However, when we're looking at the symbols in regards to marriage versus divorce, you can kind of see in regards to our trend in regards to marriage. Um, you know, what is the meaning of marriage? What's the meaning of divorce? What's the meaning of parenthood? What's the meaning of love? There's all different types of aspects when we're looking at this. But Mead kind of looked at it as, okay, well, back in the 1890s, early 1900s, marriage was more popular than divorce. What was the symbol behind that? What was the aspects behind it? In 1950s to 1960s, possibly mid 70s or mid 60s, you had this peak or low in regards to marriages, and then you had this peak in divorce. What changed? What symbols changed? What type of aspects changed? What made it more of a okay symbol to be divorced versus remaining standing married? Did people lose value behind it? You know, kind of that type of aspects. As you notice now, you kind of have this plateau of divorce rate, and you still kind of have a high in marriages, but it's also plateaued and actually decreased over the years because now people aren't so eager to get married because we cohabitate, we live together. So people don't feel the need to get married. So the the symbol of marriage hasn't lost its value from a symbolic interaction as a view. So you can kind of twist it around in regards to doing the research and analysis in regards to that. How is that social perspective? How are you looked at socially if you are divorced? How are you looked at socially if you're married? How are you looked at socially if you're a parent? You know, there's certain things there's certain symbols that go along with those that you're expected to act a certain way. So when we're looking at the marriage type aspects, historical, usually it was jobs or duties and obligations, you know, were a historical high in regards for like some, you know, marriages. That was like men's type of things, like your duties and obligations. Men were expected to work, women were expected to stay home, right? Feelings were expected to be kind of bottled up. You work through your problems, it didn't matter, right? It was very low to express your feelings. Nowadays, individuals are expressing their feelings more, which is why we have such a high divorce rate. And duties and obligations are to the bottom. They're not as high anymore. They're not on that high priority. So they kind of flip flop in regards to that meaning of marriage and divorce, right? Nowadays, there's not such of a um, stigma on people who are divorced. There's more of a, it's more common now than it was, you know, 100 years ago. So functional analysis in regards to society. How do we look at it from a functional way? How does it make us functional as a society? So society is a whole unit made up of interrelated parts that work together. Functionalism is a structural functional, right? Robert Merton, he is a functionalist. He said, you know what, there's basically three ways when we look at this. We have a intended part of our system that helps us manifest this function, right? It's, you know, if the government is saying, hey, you know what, our population is getting too low, we have too many deaths and not enough, not enough births happening. You know what, so government is going to give families who have kids from this time frame, not giving really an end of a $10,000 tax credit for individuals who have kids. This is a manifest function, right? It's offering a bonus, it's offering you a reward, it's to get you motivated, it's to get you going, right? However, there could be a latent function, or you know, or unintended consequences that kind of goes to help the system as well. Because I didn't give expiration date more or less. So say out of a sudden the, you know, government kind of came around and said, okay, after a year, you know what, we're going to go ahead and go away with the tax credit. Well, what about all the ones that are still currently pregnant? They no longer get the tax credit because now their kids weren't born in within that time frame. So that's kind of more of a less of a latent, it's a delayed, right? And an attended um, uh, a latent dysfunction, there we go. It's one of those situations where it's a stopping point. You know, it's a, you know, within regards to the bonus system, there's a drop dead stop date. So therefore, you wouldn't want to be, you know, manifest or forced into doing something. You wouldn't have to worry about the latent aspects. And then just the dysfunction of it altogether is kind of like, you know what, no more bonuses, then why should I have any more kids at all type aspects. So now, yeah, no, I don't want to move forward with it. So it's kind of like how Merton kind of did for functionalism, it kind of to express in regards to all of the aspects, you know, there's a function, there's a purpose. But however, if you don't have that purpose in an X, Y, and Z type aspects, you could have that latent and you could have a total dysfunction in regards to it as well. Merton, who spent most of his time, his academic career at Columbia University, was the major proponent of functionalism, one of the main theoretical perspectives in sociology. The other one is a conflict theory, but he was the main one for functionalism. Here, he looked at it from a functional aspects. Before we started industrializing, where factories became more more popular in regards to, you know, needing people in the factories to function and move and stuff like that. It was farmlands before. Farm families in the early, even to the, you know, mid 1900s, or early 1800s to mid 1900s, um, farm families, they were huge families, right? They had several kids. Well, there was a purpose for each one of those kids because they needed work to make sure their economic unit stayed within reason, that they had to maintain this economic unit in order to maintain their livelihood, more or less. But as of 1886, the more that the production moved away from the homes, in other words, more of the factories were built, more of the um, foundations in regards to work-wise took them away from home, and it usually took the dad away first, and then, you know, the kids, and then more frequently it's been the mom. Back in the, you know, 1800s, early 1900s, kids were allowed to work alongside with adults, so that's the reason why they said more recently the mothers were actually the last ones to physically go to work. That was kind of a consequence in regards to the dysfunction of things, right, of weakening those family ties. You know, individuals of all the family had to work in order to maintain, but at the same time the farm duties kind of went to the wayside as well. As I mentioned, there's conflict theory. Conflict theory was by Karl Marx. He was the founder for conflict theory. And when we're talking about conflict theory, it's more or less a theoretical framework in which society is viewed as composed of groups that are competing for resources, right? When we're looking at the conflict in today's society, we're looking at beyond the relationships in between the capitalists and workers. We are looking at the interest in regards to layers of society. That's how we're looking at the conflict theory in today's world. When we're looking at the feminists in the conflict theory, or the times have changed, we still have a inequality in regards to some of the jobs type of aspects and pay periods, or not pay periods, but pay wages. There's still some conflict in regards to the feminist type aspects of that, but there's still global inequalities of men and women altogether. So there's a huge factor in regards to that. And when we're applying conflict theory, how do we apply it in like the US divorce rates? You know, are they high? Are they low? What is the function, or what does the theory focus on? What does the conflict theory focus on? How men's and women's relationship have changed drastically from, you know, when divorce was kind of symboled as bad to now. Can you apply conflict theory to it? But when you're putting all the theoretical perspectives together, you're looking at each approach as a lens, right? We focus on different features. We focus on lending the distinctions between the interpretations in regards to everything. We're looking at from, is it a more of a functional aspect? Is it more of a conflict aspect? We're looking at those different approaches. We're looking at it from a micro versus a micro, you know, a macro versus a micro. But however, to give us a more of a comprehensive picture of a sociological life or a social life, we have to kind of combine both of these. We have to use the functionalism and the conflict theory, that's that macro level, right? But at the same time, we need a smaller level to go ahead and move it as well, where it's a little bit smaller in regards to how we can measure. So that's more that symbolic, that's the micro. So when we're looking at the different levels, we can kind of see when we're talking about symbolic interactionism, when we're looking at the focus of analysis, we're looking at more of the face-to-face, the interaction, how people use symbols to create social life. When we're looking at the function, we're looking at the relationship amongst the parts of society, how these parts are functioning with one another, right? Or maybe have a dysfunction with one another. And then conflict theory, we're looking at the struggle of the scarce resources by groups in which society, and how the elites, those power elites, those three major power elites, use their power to control the weaker groups, right? The inequality, the power, the conflict, the exploitations, those types of things. So you can kind of see how we need all three of these in order to analyze properly. Otherwise than that, we kind of have a disarray of how to analyze all of this. And so if we think about how we look at the interpretations of the macro versus the micro, or even the symbolic in regards to all of the aspects, neither one of them can stand alone. You have to have them together. They have to work together, and they're all essential. Both of them are essential to sociology. There's no way to define in regards to one way or the other. So you have to have them both. However, when we're looking at doing analytical research, that type of thing, and we're talking about putting our scientific theories together, we have to take the common sense away, right? Because common sense may be wrong. Moving beyond guesswork to know what is really going on. You have to have this solid foundation. You have to be able to get this validity. You have to be able to prove your research over and over and over again and get the same results over and over and over again. Otherwise than that, you're leaving some guesswork in there. You're leaving some of that common sense in there. Like if you're writing something that's like, oh, they'll know what I mean. No, don't assume, because my common sense and your common sense are two different things. Even between my husband and I, my common sense and his common sense are different as well. It's just the way how you do it. So in order to take that common sense out, you have to take out all the guesswork. You have to make sure that when you're doing your research, you have a solid foundation in regards to making sure that you have what you need. So they kind of made sure, kind of give you a flawless system if you've ever done research before. You have 8 steps to make sure that you don't fall into this trap, right? You have selecting a topic, you have defining the problem, you have reviewing the literature, you have formulating a hypothesis, you have choosing a research method, right? Collecting the data, analyzing the results, and then you share your results. Why do you analyze your results? It's to make sure you don't have any loose ends, right? So when we're taking this model and we're looking at it and we're pulling it together, each step has a purpose. When we're looking at selecting a topic, this is the very first step. What do you want to know about? That is what you basically want. That's how you select your topic, right? You're finding out, you're trying to determine. You're finding the aspects in regards to what you really want. Then you define your problem, right? When you're defining your problem, your research, in your research model, you're specifying what you want to learn about your topic in this stage. You're defining the problem. You're saying, okay, you know what? This is what I want to know. This is what I want to learn about this problem, this topic, right? Then you reverse some literature in regards to it. You find whatever you may need. You might need some type of aspects of a peer review. You might, whatever literature you're looking at to prove what you're looking for. You formulate a hypothesis, and this is just basically the 4th step, which is formulating a hypothesis as basically a statement of what you expect to find according to the prediction of the theory, right? These are the variables. Variables are factors thought to be significant of human behavior, which can vary or change from one case to the other. They're changing, right? So this is all part of this research model. Hypothesis, like I mentioned, it predicts the variables, right? It predicts the relationship among the variables. So you need to know all that. When you're getting down to choosing what method to use, do you want to use surveys? Do you want to use participation observations? Do you want to use case studies, secondary analysis, analysis of documents, whatever it might be? Then you're going to analyze all the data you collected, right? Collect all your data, then you're going to analyze it, and then you're going to share your results. So as you're going through, kind of thinking of the research model and looking at this picture in regards to it, would sociologists ruin the fun if we were gathered data on an international pillow fight day in London, right? Maybe we might, because of the way how we analyze and we look at things. But if you look at this photo, where are the older folks in reality? Where are they at? Are they even here? Did they get invited? Kind of see where all the train of thought's going, right? Why aren't they grabbing pillows if they are there? Why not? It's an International Pillow Fight Day. You can go and smack somebody with a pillow at any point in time. The sociological blood really starts to flow in regards to when we're looking at these events, right? Even something as non-serious as this. I can even say, why is this only in London? Why isn't this here in the US? Why don't we have anything International Day for us? What is the age group in this? Why are there more women than men at this event? Why, so you can kind of see kind of how all your topics, what I want to do my research on, defining that problem, you can kind of see how all the topics can kind of come up. Your topic is the International Pillow Fight, but what defining problem do you want to know about that topic? That's where that defining the problem kind of comes in. You want to specify what you want to learn. So when you're also doing it, there's 3 ways to kind of measure an average here. You can kind of look at it, for those of you who have not taken statistics, this is what this means. 3 ways of averaging: mean, median, and mode. When you're looking at the mean, you're basically taking the whole column, whatever your data is. So say that you have 8 things there, you're going to tally up all 8 of those things, and then you're going to divide it by 8. That is going to give you the average. That is the mean. When you're looking at the median, you basically have 2 columns of information, so 2 different samples, right? The median in that is the common number that is identical on both columns. That becomes your average. When you're looking at the mode, you're looking at 1 column again, and all your numbers in your column that you're looking at, whenever you have identical numbers, to give you examples, say I have 59, 59, 136, 229, 289. Well, my common numbers were 59 and 59. That becomes my average. So those are your 3 ways to measuring your average. When you're looking at research and when you're gathering it all together and you're comparing, between violence and nonviolence husbands and types of stuff like that, how are you going to find your average? Are you going to use it as a mean mode or a mean way? Are you going to use it as a median, or are you going to use it as a mode? What way is going to give you the best average of finding out the research that you're doing, right? So that's kind of up to the researcher's determination in regards to what model of measurement of average to use. How do you read a table? You have a title at the top of it, states the topic, it's located at the top of the table. You have head notes, it's not always included in the table, but when it is present, it's located just below the title. If you go through your book, you'll see that you have a title. It'll say like title or table 1.3, and then it might give you a little variation in regards to what it is off to the right of it. That's your title and your head notes, right? Beyond that, you have your headings, tells you what type of information is in the content of the table. You have your columns and rows, basic information in regards to vertically and horizontally, right? How you're going to lay it out. Then you have your sources, usually listed at the bottom, provides information on where the data in the table originated from. So if it's what type of source, where did you get it? Was it sourced as a modification of a table of whoever table from this type of research, or was this your own? You have to label in regards to what it is, so you have to source it. Keep in mind, your information isn't all yours until it's your original data. So when you're looking at surveys, there's several different types of surveys you can do. When you're selecting surveys, you're selecting a sample. And basically, a sample is an individual intended to represent the population to be studied. Sample, right? Representation of that sample is basically who is in it. What group do you want to study? Are you doing, abusive, neglective husbands? Are you doing single mom type research? What represents your sample? What is your sample of? Once you get your sample together, then you have to randomize that sample in which everyone in the target population has the same chance of being included in the study. And then you have a stratified sample, which is that it takes it just a little bit step higher, and you're making sure that the stratified sample is a form selected subgroups, right? It's a targeted population in which everyone in those subgroups has an equal chance to be included in the research as well. So that you got to think, randomized sampling is your main population group. When you're looking at stratified random sampling, this is a subgroup. It's maybe your backups. Maybe someone fell out of the research and you need to put somebody in your subgroup, right? Still have to randomize them. You want to keep neutral questions. You don't want to keep questions that are too bold to make the respondent to kind of cringe and not want to answer your questions. What's the difference between questionnaires and interviews? Establish your report. You have all these different types of things in regards to making sure that you build up to the point of where if you're doing natural questions, the individual is going to be comfortable enough with answering those questions to you openly. If you do questionnaires and interviews, the interviews the same thing. Questionnaires is okay. They don't have to answer anything directly. But if you're doing interviews, you are interviewing someone face to face. So you have to establish that rapport. But keep in mind when you're asking questions, do you want closing questions or opening questions? If you give them closing questions, you're giving them choices to select from for answers. If you give them opening questions, you're allowing them to answer freely. So when you're doing research, if you have someone who's answering freely on questions, on an open-ended questions, are you going to be able to get the research that you really need statistically? Are you going to be able to find your median, your average in regards to the results? More than likely not, because I can guarantee that you won't get the same answer twice. So a lot of, when you do questionnaires and stuff like that, they will use closing questions to make sure that you get the answers you want because you're giving them the options below. Getting the answers, like I said, interviews, if you don't have that reputation, it's going to be very hard for you to get the answers that you want. Questionnaires, same thing. The validity in regards to questionnaires isn't really truthful because sometimes individuals feel that they could kind of hide behind the questionnaires and kind of be somebody else. And when you're administrating the instrument, how are you doing it? Are you doing it in person? Are you doing it by mail? Are you doing it through other venues? Um, Ever been on a phone call and it says at the end of this phone call, stay on for the survey, right? That's another venue. So make sure the customer service is doing what they're supposed to do. Or stay on the line and take a quick survey in regards to this, that, or the other. So there's certain ways how you could get your information that you're looking for, but this is an example here in regards to a closing and open-end question in regards to, what you're really trying to find. You can kind of see closing question gives you the answers below in regards to what to select. Open-end questions give you more of the aspects of dealing with the open-end in regards to being able to do whatever you want to do. When you're looking at the participation observation from the field, in case studies, you're looking at the participation observation. The problem is when your researchers participating with this, it's hard to generalize the issue because if someone knows they're being watched, they will change their behavior in regards to what is being studied. The case studies researchers focus on a single event, situation, or individual, so they don't look at it on several different events. It's usually at one point in time. So it's one of those situations to where that single event is important, but you're observing it at one point. Researchers have generalization issues with this because you're not being able to generalize it across several different events. You're only looking at one event. So it's one of those situations to where it can be a little difficult in regards to it. When you're looking at secondary analysis, this is analyzing collected data by others. So these are those publicized research papers, peer reviews, all of that type of stuff, secondary analysis. Analysis of documents, this is examining of books, newspapers, diaries, bank records, police reports. However, when you're talking about generalization and the validity of some of this stuff, when you're looking at books, okay, great, it has its sources. It has to do research as well, so it's collecting other secondary analysis. When you're talking about newspapers, same thing with social media when you watch the news. You could pick up one newspaper and pick up another newspaper, and they're not going to be identical. So the validity in between them isn't always going to match. So the validity is where you're looking at what could be repeated over and over again, right? Same thing with diaries. Diaries is someone's personal thoughts, personal relationships. Bank records, same thing. If you want to know your spending habits and what you spend the most in, review your bank statements, and I'm pretty sure you'll be surprised in regards to it. Same thing with police reports. These are analyzing the documents. When you're looking at police reports, however, there could be some biased discretion in regards to police reports in regards to what is being reported, because if it's like on a domestic violence, it's a he says, she says situation. So the police has to build a report off of what he's hearing from both sides. So a lot of it's all hearsay. So analyzing those second documents can kind of be a little tricky when you're looking at your experiment and making sure that you're getting the proper information that you need. So experiments have experimental and control groups, right? Independent and dependent variables. So when you're looking at experimental groups, these are groups of subjects in the experiment who are exposed, right? They're exposed, this is your independent variable, they're exposed to the treatments. So they are gonna make sure that your causes and changes are occurring, right? They're being exposed to whatever the treatment may be. Then you have a control group, right? The control group, they're not exposed to the independent variable. So this is your dependent variable, right? They're not exposed to the experiment. So when you're looking at the variables are factors that are thought of to be significant in human behavior, which can vary or change from one case to the other. Well, when you're looking at an independent variable, it's being changed because it is part of the experimental group. It's getting that treatment. It's exposed to the treatment plan, right? And your control group is not controlled, so therefore it becomes your dependent variable. So that way you have different types of things. It's not, exposed. I hope that all makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, by all means, email me and let me know. So when you're looking at the causes and effects of correlation can kind of get funky if you've ever taken statistics. You have this back and forth that kind of goes back and forth in regards to what is first necessary conditions of correlations, right? You have to have two variables that exist together. They are said to be correlated. However, people often assume that correlation is causation, but correlation never proves causation. So if you've taken statistics, I'm sure this has been embedded in you. If you haven't taken statistics, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a taste. Just because something happens doesn't mean that it has to be the causation for that thing to happen. It just could be a coincidence and it's always there when it's there. So kind of give you an example of that is like, when it's hot outside, they say that more people die in pools. Well, granted, it's kind of the thing, so okay, correlation, it's causation because, people swim in the summertime only. Not necessarily. You just hear about it more because it's hotter outside than it is during the winter. So therefore, like I said, correlation can never prove that causation. You can't prove the fact that people die more because it's hot outside. You just don't hear about it more. So either variable could be the cause of the other, or there could be no causation at all. So it's one of those situations you kind of have to be careful when you're doing your research and you're kind of, if you have those control groups and that type of aspects, that you're making sure. When you're looking at the secondary necessary conditions, which is the temporal priority, this means that one thing happens before something else does. For a variable to be a cause, the independent variable, it must precede that which is changed, the dependent variable. So it kind of has to be there. It needs to be there prior to. Although that the necessity of the temporal priority is obvious, but it's not always easy to determine. It's always hard to see what that third type of, condition might be. This is a necessary condition, which is the spatial relation. Even if we can identify the correlation and we can determine the temporal priority, we can have basically a third underlying variable. It could be as simple as the colors on the walls, not realizing that every room that maybe they're in, the sample groups are in, that they're not all identical. It could be as simple as that. So it's not always easily to identify. If you're doing a a quiet test in regards to do people do better in study groups that are completely silent with no talking, no music, no nothing on, versus one that is doing music. If you do a research like that and say there's construction going outside and you're really not paying attention, well, guess what? That's a third underlying variable, because now your quiet group is not fully quiet because there's construction going outside. So that would be easily to identify, but usually they're not that easy. It's a little bit harder in regards to determining that type of aspects. So correlation is two or more variables are presented together. The more often these variables are found together, the stronger the relationship, right? To indicate their strengths, sociologists use a number called correlation coefficient. When you have this correlation coefficient, it's if two variables are always presented together, they have what they call a perfect positive correlation. The number is represented like in a positive aspects. You could also have a perfect negative correlation, which means that one variable is present when the other one is absent. That is the perfect negative. So if you have both variables always presented together, you're going to have a positive correlation. If you have one variable that is present and one that is always absent, you're going to have a perfect negative correlation. These are very easy to spot when you start doing calculations and stuff like that. And there's a positive correlation example in the middle that you guys could read, and it's in your book as well. So it kind of gives you a full in-depth understanding in regards to those correlation and coefficients. When you're looking at ethical implications, you're looking at people may not always be aware that they're being studied. This is that universal observation. If you're doing a study on homeless people, this is people are not aware that you're doing studies. You might be just a random person standing there out in the middle of nowhere observing, right? They're not aware of what you're doing. And this is kind of be, ethical kind of implications, because you are studying an individual human being and they have no idea what is going on, and you're doing research on that individual. So when you're looking at the implications, you have to be aware that you're not describing the individual too much to where you're not crossing the ethical boundary kind of guides. We have to make sure that we stay within our human ethical implications in regards to not violating the privacies. So you always have to be aware in regards to that. However, at the same time, if you walk into a grocery store, if you walk along campus, if you're, within an airport, you are on a surveillance at all times. We know this, we are adapted to it, but does this really change being measured or being researched all the time? So you kind of have to look at it, does this make us shape our behavior any differently because we know we are being watched? For some people, maybe they do. For some people, it's become so adapted to where we know that we're on camera, we function just fine and we move as normal. But when you're looking at this and when you're trying to do a crime surveillance, are you violating that? Are you going beyond those ethical implications in regards to when you're looking at a surveillance camera? Is kind of where they're kind of going with it. When you're looking at gender and sociology research can also lead to an interviewer bias, depending on what you're doing research on. If you're very passionate about something and if you have a strong connection with it, be cautious in regards to who you are interviewing, because you could be your tone of voice, the way you ask questions can change if it's directed more to a man versus a female or vice versa. um, it can affect the kind of research that is done. It could alter the way how you're kind of putting your research together. So gender is a big type of aspects in regards to that. When you're looking at the ethics of the research as well, protecting the subjects, they did this research in regards to gentlemen that are part of the military. You can't discuss, military guys can't discuss a lot of things in regards to what happened in regards to, if they've been overseas at war or whatever like that. So in order, if you're doing research, you have to make sure that you're protecting those subjects' identities, that you're not giving out information that could get them in harm's way. Um, at the same time as you're briefing your subjects and you're letting them know what the research is about, make sure you're leading them to the right way and don't be like Humphrey's research where it misled the subjects into a different way. They were supposed to be doing one research. He misled the research and the subjects into the wrong way. It ended up turning into um, kind of more or less of a fiasco, because he was doing it basically on he was doing it on some type of like restroom research type aspects. Humphreys was, and it ended up being misleading to the subjects in regards to what was the purpose of what they were supposed to be doing. And they end up doing like the wrong research type aspects. So make sure when you're making sure you're doing your research in the aspects, and if you're using a human beings in regards to that aspects, you have to make sure you're protecting the subjects, you're protecting their identity, you're making sure you're being ethical because these are human beings and you have to brief them in the right way. You make sure that you're leading down the right path and you're telling them exactly what the research that you are doing and that you're not misleading them. Otherwise than that, it can kind of get your research and your results kind of murky and kind of end up in the wrong type of aspects. So you have to be really cautious in regards to that. When you're looking at the trending shapes of our future of sociology. Sociology is very tension in regards to research versus reform. Um, when we look at the stages, there's 3 stages of sociology. That we have to look at it at the fact of first phase is, you know, primary purpose of sociology research to improve society. When we're looking at the second phase of certain things, we're looking at, the concerns switch from developing abstract knowledge. And then the thirds, we're looking at, you know, which we're still in, which is the third phase, is sociology seeks ways to apply the research findings. How do we do that? How do we change it? How do we look at it from a globalization aspects, right? Growing interconnections among nations as results of um, advice and trades and travels and communications. How do we make this more of a globally thing? How can we invest profits and do our rational systems and still not have this best research and practice globally? So that's kind of how we're looking at it. So they look at the tension reforms in regards to 3 different phases. Like I said, first phase is research improves societies. Second phase is searches develops abstract knowledge. And third phase is finds the ways to apply their research findings. So it's kind of one of those situations to where we need to look at it from a globalization. We need to broaden our horizons and consider global issues that also go along with this. And then we have to look at, are there really universal principles, which we'll see in chapter 2 in regards to when we're talking about universal gestures and that type of things. Are there universal principles as well that help us globally? So you kind of have to look at it as like the bigger horizons of things. So that is chapter 1. Um, if you guys have any questions or concerns that maybe you didn't get, please reach out via email, and I will see and talk to you guys soon.